Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We do have an insightful workshop on fire-resilient landscaping, strategic planting for fire safety with Hannah Thompson-Welch. Hannah is the Wildlife Mitigation Specialist for the North Carolina Forest Service. Hannah has served in this role since July of 2016 and has more than 20 years of service with the state of North Carolina. Hannah assesses wildlife risk and develops recommendations to implement strategies to reduce the potential for destructive wildfire impacts. Hannah is also serving as the manager of the National Interagency Community Mitigation Assistant Team. We're going to hand it off to Hannah now.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon. I'm sorry, afternoon. I am Hannah Thompson-Welch, as Mariah said, and I currently only serve 50 counties for North Carolina. I've served the eastern 50 counties because we recently hired someone to cover the western 50 counties. I do currently cover the 50 counties in the east, but I'm assisting with training the new person for the western counties. And I'm really happy to be here today and happy to be able to talk to you about something that is near and dear to me and something that I try to do on my own home in my own community. So I hope that this will provide some additional context for some things that you may want to employ in your own community. So today we're going to learn about what makes some plants more flammable than others, which plants are less flammable, especially plant species native to our state here in North Carolina, and then how to strategically install plants around your home and garden to minimize that fire risk. And I don't know where you're calling in from today. I'm sure it's all over the state. We do have wildfires all over the state. We average about 4,500 to 5,000 fires per year. We keep them relatively small, so you may not even know they've burned in your neighborhood unless you talk to someone from the fire department or the Forest Service. So just to let you know, wildfire is a problem statewide, and the majority of those fires are human caused. So that's why this topic is very timely right before fall fire season really kicks off. I know we had some fires just recently up in the mountains, so maybe this will help someone who's trying to make some decisions about their property, and maybe y'all can pass this information on. So the factors that affect plant flammability. So all plants have different characteristics. They will all burn in the right condition, even during like an extended drought like we saw in 2016, and even from this spring and the spring wildfire season that we had in the mountains. So vegetation is a fuel, and the drier it gets, the greater likeness it will ignite. As you learned probably this spring, as you either watch the news or you experience the fire risk up in the western part of North Carolina, you may have noticed some things in your own yard. I don't know if you pay attention to things, but as a Forest Service person, I know that when the leaves get crunchy outside, it's really, really dry. And I'm sure as master gardeners and others, that y'all probably notice the same things. That's just one general, but the fuel on the ground, that plant material, it is all impacted by high temperatures, low humidities, low precipitation, the time of year, the time of day. It just depends, right? Because in the evenings, our humidity comes up most of the time, unless we don't have very good humidity recovery. Time of year, when we're going through drier parts of the year, of course, our vegetation is going to be drier. It's also impacted by the size and shape of that vegetation, the density of the vegetation, what the vegetation is made up of chemically, and then other characteristics. Fire behavior and fire spread are influenced by plants surrounding houses. So the way fire behaves around a home is influenced by the vegetation that surrounds it. Landscape plants are the most common fuel around a home, and plants with low flammability are recommended for fire-resistant landscaping. So some of what we're going to talk about today are low flammability plant options to replace high flammability plants. Because in some cases, if I were to visit your home and give you recommendations based on what I see and based on my experience and training, I may tell you to replace that plant with something less flammable. We do have a low flammability plant list within a publication called Fire Resistant Landscaping in North Carolina. And it's also linked to the North Carolina Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox. And I'll show you what that looks like a little bit later today. We're going to start with examining specific characteristics of leaves and branches that cause a plant to have that lower flammability. Resins, oils, and waxes that are found in several plants' leaves and branches are highly flammable. If anybody's ever saw pine straw burn or pine needles burn, that exhibits it perfectly. They're usually good for a good campfire starting material. Any of those things that you can use for that purpose, they're going to be more flammable in your home's landscaping as well. And then, so if a plant has minimal resins, oils, and waxes in its plant parts, or if you notice a distinct odor when crushing that plant part, well, let me reverse what I just said. So if it has minimal resins, oils, and waxes in plants parts, it is considered low flammability. And then if you notice a distinct odor when crushing the plant part, it may be highly flammable. Low flammability characteristics also are high moisture content in plants. So let's look at a few of those. Give me just a moment. There we go. Thick, wide leaves are an indication that is a broadleaf plant, which contains a higher ratio of moisture to the size compared to smaller leaves, such as a pine or a juniper. Palm fronds are one exception. I don't know if we have a lot of palm fronds around, but I know down where I live in the east, we do have some palm trees planted, even though they're not native. Those palms contain wide, flat leaves that are highly flammable. Palm flammability risk is reduced, however, if dead fronds are removed and do not allow fire to move to the upper portion of the canopy. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through. We're going to talk about something called ladder fuels. So if those palm fronds are hanging low, there's a greater probability that the flames could go vertical up the side of the palm tree, which could throw embers. So some of the examples we have here are the palm trees, which are highly flammable. And then we have 3 low flammability options: camellia, red maple, and southern magnolia. And that you might think that a magnolia is more flammable because of the waxy nature of their leaves, but they are considered low flammability. We're going to next explore whole plant flammability, not just the leaves and the branches, but the whole tree or whole plant. In general, deciduous trees are less flammable than conifers and evergreens. For example, pine trees and juniper shrubs have higher flammability than a hickory or a yellow poplar. A few exceptions to this are southern magnolia, camellia, bald cypress, which are 2 evergreens and a deciduous conifer respectively, all having lower flammability. When the leaves are shed, how they perch or hang on other plants can determine whole plant flammability. For example, because pine needles are bundled, when they shed, they hang on or perch on other plants, and that increases the flammability around them. The image on the lower left shows how pine needles have perched on a flammable juniper shrub. I'm sure y'all see this in your work. Additionally, whole plant Low flammability characteristics include vegetation that has an open form or loose branching as compared to a denser form and thick branching. Oaks and azaleas are example of open plant form and loose branching compared to the dense form and tight branching of an arborvitae. And I seen in this image here. Oh, I'm sorry. Low flammability is also characterized by vegetation that sheds its dead leaves and branches as opposed to retaining them. Some pine species, like Virginia pine and sand pine, will retain dead lower branches, while shortleaf and loblolly tend to shed those branches. Part of deciduous trees' lower flammability is the shedding of leaves annually versus retaining the dead leaves. This is a reason why deciduous conifers like bald cypress has lower flammability than other conifers because it sheds its needles annually. These shed leaves may burn on the ground in the event of a fire, but are unlikely to ignite the canopy of a tree or the canopy of a shrub if the branches of the trees are high enough for the flames not to reach. That also is true of shrubs. So it all depends on the continuity of the plant material, both horizontally and vertically. The final whole plant low flammability characteristic we're going to cover includes plants that don't have peeling or papery bark like river birch and loose fibers like eastern red cedar. So if it lacks that peeling bark or loose fibers, then it's considered a low flammability characteristic. Plants don't shed a large volume of debris. Let's consider this river birch on the side here on the right side of the screen. Would you consider that high flammability or low flammability?
High.
Of differences of opinion on how flammable a river birch is. In North Carolina, though, we consider it a low flammability plant. Most of the time, if you think about a river birch and the way that it is on the landscape, wherever it is planted or wherever it is growing, while that bark does peel back, it has loose fibers. They're usually located in a place that's more moist as the plant itself. It does shed some of the fiber that comes off the bark that comes off the trunk of the tree, but it doesn't shed a ton of it. It just usually hangs there. Most of the time when I see them in the landscape, whether they're in an urban setting or in a forested setting, their branches are not really close to the ground. And I think that they're fairly low disease and pest. They have low disease and pest susceptibility. So I believe that's why in North Carolina, they're deemed to be low flammability. Also here, you'll see the white oak, which is also low flammability. It meets all those low flammability characteristics. Okay, now we're going to look at some examples of high and low flammability plants in southeastern U.S. species. So for trees, some of the higher flammability trees are American holly, eastern red cedar, or juniper, and then various species of pine. This pine the photograph was from the South Carolina Native Plant Society, but most pine trees can be managed to reduce their fire risk. You can trim them up from the bottom and they can be managed fairly easily. Each one of these contains resins and oils in the needles or leaves that they have. So that's why they are highly flammable. Also, if you look at these photos, the pine tree, you can't really tell how close those limbs are to the ground because of the label we have on there. But the American holly and the eastern red cedar both are exhibiting horizontal and vertical continuity of the fuels. So you can see that each of them could be affected if a fire was beside them or like an ember fell adjacent to them. They could possibly ignite horizontally and then burn vertically. So that's something to consider.
Hey, Hannah, while we were still on that slide, there was a question about how high would you actually need to trim that pine? Like, is there a target or is it in relation to the roof of your house? How would you gauge how much clearance you need
For
underneath the
the
tree to reduce it, the fire
for the
risk?
pine tree, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we always say to leave at least a third of the canopy if it's on a smaller tree, but if it's a larger tree, we say 6 to 10 feet. You could trim that up, like from the ground, 6 feet up, just buck your limbs up, and that would reduce the continuity of flames being able to travel vertically up into the canopy of that tree. And a lot of times, if you do have a pine close to your house, you know it's going to drop pine needles all over your roof. So not only do you have to worry about the needles that horizontal and vertical continuity from the ground, but you also have to worry about the impacts if a fire were to start near your home, under your tree, or whatever. If there was enough intensity to that fire that it would throw firebrands or embers to other places, like if the wind were to carry, just like a campfire, if you can imagine that, where, you know, the embers go up. Sometimes they carry ash with them and then it travels adjacent to other places, just depending on the wind speed and everything. So you also have to worry about the firebrand risk. I hope that answers that question.
Excellent, thank you.
You're welcome. And then we have some low flammability species, which are hickory, bald cypress, oak, maple, flowering dogwood, all beautiful, beautiful species. Oaks have that open form and often wide, thick leaves, unless there's some of the more slender species of leaves on oak trees. They're also mostly deciduous. Maples and dogwoods and hickories have that low flammability characteristic. Bald cypress it's a conifer, although it's deciduous, so it sheds its leaves in the fall, as we've already spoken about. So other low flammability trees include magnolias, elms, buckeyes, yellow poplar, or some people call it tulip poplar, ash, American sycamore, and London plane tree. Now we're going to move into shrubs. Several native and non-native shrubs are highly flammable. Yaupon or Ilex vomitoria, which is a holly found more commonly in the coastal plain, has high flammability. In fact, it's commonly referred to as a gasoline tree by fire professionals because it burns so easily and quickly. Rhododendron is one from the mountains that I think of when I think about highly flammable shrubs. Inkberry is one, wax myrtle, saw palmetto, juniper. There's a lot of different plants that are highly flammable in the shrub category. Ornamental juniper is a common landscape shrub that is very flammable. The leaves contain oils and are thin. The plant form is dense and often has those lower branches close to the ground. For low flammability shrubs, we have American beautyberry, which is one of my favorites, native azalea, viburnum, hydrangea, and buttonbush. If we think about the characteristics of these plants, most of them have wide, thick leaves with higher moisture content. They have an open form and loose structure, and the leaves lack oils, waxes, and resins. So you're kind of seeing a trend with all of these photographs. All vines can contribute to ladder fuels, which we've already spoke about, that horizontal and vertical continuity. If you look at the photo on the left, which is that Carolina jessamine, you can see that it's formed kind of a dense, almost hedge-like structure, and then it's stretching outward. So that could be a contributor. If it was a high flammability plant, it could be a contributor to fire spread. But in this instance, it's a low flammability vine. It all depends on the species of the vine. and how flammable it is, whether or not it can contribute to fire spread. The native vines on this slide have higher moisture content in their leaves and are considered to have lower flammability compared to other vines. But again, caution should still be used in utilizing vines just because of the way they spread in horizontal and vertical continuity. Now we have some herbaceous plants, low flammability. They're beautiful. They offer color and texture to any yard or garden space. Several of them are annual and perennial native and non-native plants. They're considered to have low flammability, including the plants on this slide. Sedum, considered a type of succulent, is one of the few plants that can somewhat safely be planted close to the house in the immediate zone. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that immediate zone means. Other low-growing herbaceous plants may be planted in the immediate zone if they are carefully maintained, but any plants in the immediate zone are still at risk of igniting a home. And we're going to get into a lot more on what those zones look like shortly. And then we have some ground cover here, low flammability as well. Pachysandra, ajuga, sedum, wintergreen, eastern prickly pear cactus, and phlox. They can be a source of horizontal fuels and also contribute to ladder fuels, and so their placement in a fire escape should be carefully considered. Several have high moisture content leaves, loose form, and minimal resins, waxes, and oils here. Now this one, you're going to see that big red X. Grass is very flammable if it's tall. So as a result, ornamental grasses should not be included in a fire resistant landscape or a fire resilient landscape. A lawn, however, that's moist and well maintained can serve as a fuel break and have lower flammability. We did at one time have a group of townhouses that burned. Like we had a urban conflagration due to 3-inch grass in one of the larger cities in North Carolina. So even though we say here that it's fine as long as it's less than 4 inches and it's watered, we have to be very careful during fire seasons and when we are in drought conditions, because even lawn mowers, like here in the picture, that can be a source of fire if it hits a rock or something else. So we have to use caution even with grass. And if it's a high grass like broom straw or pampas grass or one of the others, we have to be really careful. They can be beautiful in a landscape, but they are still very flammable. We're going to transition just a little bit to the publication that I mentioned. I wanted to show you what the cover looks like. Some of you may have seen this already. You may use it as a reference, but in this document, and I'm one of the authors on the document, as well as several extension forestry professionals and others, it has lists of plants in it that I'm going to forward to the slide here. So you'll see that it's broken down by the soil moisture, the needs of light, what the native region the plant is, and if it has any wildlife value. The scientific name and the common name are both listed, and you can see the matrix on how you could figure out what would work for your location. If you had full sun and you had dry soil moisture and you were in the Piedmont, so on and so forth. So it's a really good resource. In the document this is one of the low flammability charts, and it goes everything from tall trees all the way down to ground cover in most of them. One of the things that's not in there is grasses, unless it's in the high flammability category. But this is how the document's broken apart, and the charts are color coded. So if it's green, then it's low flammability. If it's orange, it's medium flammability. And then if it's red, it's high flammability. But this kind of gives you a view of it if you've not reviewed this publication in the past. And there will be links to it in the document, and I will make sure and leave my slides behind so that you can access this. Also, if you click one of these, I hope you can see my mouse button. Can someone confirm that you can?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so if you click the scientific name for any of the species, it will take you to the North Carolina Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox. It will take you there, and then you can find out a lot more information about each plant. So it's a great thing that it is connected in that way to the North Carolina Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox. And we're going to look at that as well. So I just pulled an image from the header down, and then in the attributes category is where you'll find that fire risk rating, and I've got it circled there. So not all the plants in the toolbox have that, but there are many that do. I hope that many of you have already discovered that, but I think it's really interesting that that's available for us, and I'm really happy that it is. So we're going to go through a little review of what we've talked about so far before we move forward. The degree of flammability will be determined if and where a plant is recommended to be located in a landscape. Plant flammability is also heavily dependent on several environmental factors. Even with low flammability plants, it is important to maintain those plants seasonally to remove excess fuels. Even low flammability plants need to be arranged in the landscape in such a way that they will not create that vertical and horizontal continuity we've been talking about. Low flammability plants need to be surrounded by fuel breaks, and in some cases that can be a driveway or a walkway, a road. Those are all fuel breaks that already exist, because all plants will burn in the right conditions. Though it's not recommended, a homeowner may want to leave high flammability plants in the landscape, even closer to the home, because I understand that some people are very attached to the plants in their yard. However, that placement of that plant or group of plants should be carefully considered to avoid igniting the home in the event of a wildfire. In review, low flammability plants are typically deciduous, have wide, flat leaves with higher moisture content, and the plant structure is open, and the leaves and branches contain a low concentration of oils, resins, and waxes. And then I have some references here to the material that fed the presentation that you've seen so far. And now this is where the bread and butter for the work that I do comes into play. So a lot of people ask, how effective is this? If I want to do fire resilient landscaping, how effective is it? Well, just like the plants depend on several factors, that it's going to be the same for your landscape. So whether we're in a drought, if you've maintained it, if you have flammable or combustible construction materials that your house is made up of, what does your emergency access look like? What does your neighbor's defensible space look like? And then what does their neighbor's defensible space look like? And how are your homes arranged on the landscape? It depends a lot. It varies. So fire resilient landscaping can increase the chance that a home will not burn, but it's more, if you want to practice fire resilient landscaping, it's better to do it as a group. It's more efficacious at a neighborhood or community level. And we're going to talk about the home ignition zones. These home ignition zones come from a program. It's a recognition program for residents called Firewise USA, and it's brought to all the 50 states by the National Fire Protection Association. And I am a Firewise liaison for North Carolina. So that means if you live in a community that wants to take part in this program, then I'm the person that comes out to do the risk assessment for that in North Carolina. And soon my coworker will also be trained to do those assessments. So right now it will be me and he if we're in the western part of the state, and just me if it's on this part of the state, or in the eastern part of the state. But we always do that in concert with the county ranger, because the county rangers are in all 100 counties or the position is if there's a vacancy there right now. So Firewise USA home ignition zones kind of outline what needs to happen in each zone. It takes into account plant spacing, landscape structures, and fuel breaks. As you can see in this photo, there's a road, there's a path leading up to the house, and then there's your driveway. There's also a non-combustible rock border that goes all the way around that back patio that looks to be made of rock as well. All three zones are important, but the most critical one is that immediate zone in the 0 to 5 feet zone from your foundation of your house and any wooden attachments. So if you had a deck that was made of wood, or you have steps, or you have a landing, or whatever it is, whatever that wooden structure is, it is also included in that 0 to 5 foot zone. So those are considered attached to the house because we can't break them apart. So that 0 to 5 foot zone in this image is red. And you'll notice in this photo that there's not a lot of things in that zone. There's some gravels, it looks like. There may be a few planters with some flowers in them, but there's not much in that zone. And there's a reason for that. Scientific research shows and has been proven that the 0 to 5 foot zone, whatever's in that zone, can lessen the impacts of wildfire on a home. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and the specific things that should or should not occur in those zones. Then the intermediate zone is the zone from 5 feet, where that red zone ends, until 30 feet. It's the orange zone, and you'll notice that there's more vegetation in that zone than there is in the immediate zone. And then the extended zone is from the edge of that orange zone, the 30-foot zone, to 100 feet or more if you have more property. In the immediate zone, the broad recommendations are to remove all or most flammable fuels. So that includes landscaping plants that cover up your foundation. Now, I know, I've been all over North Carolina talking about this, and I do know that that is a sticking point for some communities, because if they live in a homeowners association, sometimes the covenants or ordinances that are governed by the homeowners association may be counter to what this message is. I know that in a community down in Brunswick County, they have to maintain foundation plantings that screen their foundation from their neighbors. So when you drive through that community, you don't see any exposed foundations. However, if they have a fire in that area and it is a continuous hedge of landscaping plants within that 5-foot zone, there could be a different story that gets told once that happens, because it would be highly susceptible to wildfire. In this zone, we also suggest to use non-combustible mulch. And when I say non-combustible mulch, I mean things like river rock, pea gravel, lava rock, whatever meets your aesthetic. And then walkways can always serve as fuel breaks, just like the driveway in this picture. And remember, this 0 to 5 foot zone is the most critical. So what do I propose? I went up to a community in Mitchell County recently, and there was one home that had a clear 0 to 5 foot zone beside. They had mowed grass in there, and they had a few issues in around an adjacent structure that was near the home. So it was probably in the 5 to 30 foot zone, that other structure. But since it was in 30 feet of the home, then we had to count it as if it was part of the house. So there was a few issues outside of that 0 to 5 foot zone, but in the 0 to 5, it was pretty much cleared out. And then 5 feet from the home, they started with our landscaping plants, which is what this program would suggest, or thinning them out so they're not providing that horizontal continuity and vertical continuity up towards the eaves of your house, which is where your vents are. I do have pictures of another home where they had pine straw as their mulch and bushes up under some eaves. There was a fire that went through a yard with 3-inch grass and spread to that landscaping. The pine straw ignited, the bushes up under the eaves ignited, and then they had vinyl soffits and they were just hanging down like pieces of cloth. And just inside that space, there were holes that led up into the roof. So we know that what this program tells us is true. We've had demonstrated examples here in North Carolina. So we're going to talk a little bit more about plants in the immediate zone. So understand the risk of planting in the zone. Does this house look like the last image that we showed? Not really. But what you will notice on this picture is that the plants are low to the ground. They're kind of in clumps. They look relatively close together, but some of them do have space in between them. So that's where the maintenance comes in that we've already talked about. And making sure that the plants that are planted in this zone are succulents like cactus or sedum, low-growing herbaceous plants, just like I showed here, and make sure the lawn is maintained. And you'll also see that this photograph has a non-combustible mulch option. So I think this is aesthetically pleasing. I don't know about you. I know it's not lush and green and overflowing with the plants that we all think are beautiful, like the spillers, the thrillers, and the fillers in some container gardening that I've recently learned about. But I still think it's beautiful in its own way, and it matches the aesthetic of the house that it's on the outside of. And this came from Washington State University. Now, what about landscape beds in this 0 to 5 foot zone or beyond the 0 to 5 feet zone? Let's look at these two photographs. I'll give you just a minute to form some opinions here. Landscape beds are the most likely place where ladder fuels occur. People often plant landscape beds with varying heights of plants. You got to get that dimension and the texture right, or that's what most people like to see. And then with the ground cover or organic mulch, though one should generally avoid the ladder fuels. If the image on the top right, if it's like that one, these fuels are far away from the home and it's surrounded by fuel breaks. So you can see that driveway right beside it. It does appear that they're using pine straw landscaping or a shredded bark mulch that is colored red. It's kind of a little bit tough to see from the photo, but so it does have a flammable mulch option, but it's far away from that house. It's not going to be within the 5 or the 30-foot zone, or that's how it appears to in the picture to me. If, on the other hand, the landscape bed with the ladder fuels are immediately adjacent to the home, such as that lower image, this house is at risk to home ignition. In fact, the foundation shrubs, as seen on the lower image near the railing of the porch, are a common way homes can ignite. We see this a lot all over the state with just vegetation planted too close to the railings on the house. And over time, we know the vegetation grows. And some people do maintain it. Some people don't. I have a house pretty close to where I live that there's no maintenance done in the 0 to 5 foot zone. And then there are places that don't even have a 0 to 5 foot zone. They just have mowed grass. But I know that everybody's aesthetic taste is different. So this gives you a little indication of what works and what's problematic according to the Firewise USA program and what we recommend. So in the orange zone or the 5 to 30 foot zone, we recommend that single specimens or small clusters of shrubs or trees are well spaced. That way, we're breaking up the horizontal and vertical continuity. We don't want the ladder fuel issue to be there. Thin organic mulch is okay. And if people want to use pine straw in their landscape, and let's say they live in the sand hills and pine straw is abundant, we ask that they just remove the pine straw from the 0 to 5 foot zone. We understand, but if it's thin, not big piles of it, and we all know that that's like volcano mulch is not really okay for our plants. There are more issues that arise when we use the big piles of volcano mulch. And I hope everybody knows what I'm talking about. It's just like a big pile of mulch with the hole kind of around the bottom of the plant. Also in this zone are the fuel breaks of the driveway and the lawn, and then plants and beds are moisture. They have moisture in them. That's the biggest thing. So if we're going to have plants and beds in this zone, we want them to have moisture. So here is a recently assessed home from Mitchell County. It is a beautiful place, but the fuel here, that's a walkway. As you can see, there's a walkway there. And right up against the house, there's rhododendron there. There's mountain laurel there. There's all kinds of waxy-leaved plants. You can see them all in the photograph there. I recently did an assessment on this home and gave some recommendations to the homeowner. There was even a tiny rhododendron growing between a deck and an outbuilding, which probably have less than 18 inches separation. There was a rhododendron growing like in the crack between the roofs of those two, where the deck was and where the porch was and the outbuilding was. So these are some of the things that we see in the field. And even when we do maintain the fuels, like if this homeowner did go and do some of the recommendations that we gave, with the rate that things grow here in North Carolina, like that maintenance is ongoing, like continuously. We're going to talk about the extended zone. So that's the 30 to 100 foot zone, which is that green zone. Limited vegetation is still recommended, but single specimens or clusters of trees and shrubs can be spaced closer together in this zone. It's recommended to create fuel breaks between plants or groups of plants, and this could be a well-maintained lawn or pathway. Ground leader like mulch can be used in this zone, but areas of heavy ground leader should be minimized. And then we're also always thinking about those ladder fuels, trying to make sure that the continuity does not, like everything doesn't touch each other. Like we want to break it up as much as possible. And I know that's difficult, but groups of trees are fine. And then remove young evergreen trees between mature trees, and that's to break that continuity up. Remove all the dead plant material, which can serve as a pocket for an ember to land in. And then landscape structures placed in this zone, like sheds, play structures, like playhouses, tree houses, should be placed out in this zone. And one thing I forgot to mention is, see the LP gas tank in this photograph? That should be outside the 30 foot zone. So it would be in this zone as well. And then we're kind of ramping down now from everything we've been talking about. And the main thing to remember is that maintenance is essential. This checklist came out. It's table 2 in the fire resistant landscaping in North Carolina. publication, and it's just a list of maintenance. There's also a separate list, a checklist of items from the Firewise USA program, and I can try to get that to our hosts today to get distributed to you all. But this is just kind of a very simply for fire resistant landscaping, the checklist of recommended maintenance. Keeping dead trees or snags to attract wildlife only if the snag is on the outer edge of the defensible space, 80 to 100 feet from the home. That's one of them for standing dead trees. Fire risk cannot be minimized if the landscape is not maintained. So that's the biggest thing, is just making sure that everything that you're doing in your landscape is maintained over time. And hopefully, if we all take into account the things that we've talked about today, then our homes will survive the next wildfire that could be coming near you. We never know when they're going to happen because most of our fires are human caused. So I'm really happy that I had this opportunity to speak to you all today. And are there any more questions, Charlotte?
Yeah, there's actually several really good questions that have been coming in chat. When you were talking about the closest zone to the house, the first 5 feet, the question
Mhm.
came in about leaving the leaves. So, a lot of people are interested in leaving leaves that fall in their yard to provide habitat for microorganisms and wildlife. But would your recommendation be not to leave the leaves in that 5 foot, that closest zone?
I would definitely not during fire season, and we all know when the leaves come off. I understand the want to leave them there, but for protection of your home, I would not recommend leaving them.
Yes. Okay. A really good question related. So we've been focusing on the plants and the landscape, but there's a question about if there's any research that looks at the type of house siding and flammability.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So there is an organization called the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. It's actually in South Carolina. They build huge homes on this indoor lab. They have a turntable, and they try to recreate how wind impacts embers, and then they set a fire in their ember generator, is what they call it. And then they do research on different types of siding materials. What we recommend is like a fiber cement siding. If you're going to replace siding in the future, that's what the recommendation is. And that came from the research that we've seen. A non-combustible siding option. And they make all different kinds. They even make some that looks like cedar shakes shingles, but it's made out of fiber cement board. I've seen all different kinds of really pretty siding that comes from the distributors of fiber cement siding.
Can you talk a little about a non-combustible mulch to use in North Carolina?
Yeah, so we have a Firewise building at the state fairgrounds, and we chose to use river rock there with a landscape barrier underneath would be ideal. Lava rock, pea gravel, it just depends on what your aesthetic is. There's all different colors, all different types of rock, but it would always be a rock option. We don't suggest rubber mulch or bark mulch. There has been some research done on composted mulch. I have a publication which outlines the combustibility of different types of mulch, and I would be happy to provide that to y'all to distribute to the participants today if you would like me to.
That'd be perfect.
I don't think you got to the question about where firewood should be stored.
Oh, yes. So firewood should be in that outside that 30-foot zone, so at least 30 feet away. The reason for that is because embers, if they come to your house, like in the example that I gave about the house that was impacted by a fire and it burned up to the house and the bushes. If there were embers or firebrands coming off of anything that was burning, those embers will get sucked into old trees, old snags. It happens like in fire suppression all the time. embers find places to land, they will land in between the pieces of firewood that are stacked, and then they can combust if they sit there long enough and they get all the oxygen and everything that they need. They can combust. So it is recommended by the Firewise USA program, which follows all the research that's done by the Institute for Business and Home Safety lab that I was talking about. That is where a lot of that research happens, and then the recommendations are passed on to all of us in the community of professionals that follow that information.
Excellent. Yes. And all of the resources you've mentioned sharing, just to let everybody know, we will have them in the resource document we create and send out with all of our continuing education webinars. So that'll be much appreciated, Hannah. Anything you share with us, we'll make sure gets captured and shared with our folks.
On the North Carolina EMG intranet is where you're going to find the recording probably by the end of the week, along with the resources that Hannah has shared here. Hannah, this was so helpful. Thank you so much. Seeing all those visuals and the diagrams were super helpful to help us understand safety measures, especially when we go into this winter season that is starting tonight, for us to understand how to protect our homes and our landscaping. Let's see if we missed any more questions.
And I'd like to add one more thing. So the
Yeah.
background that's behind me, this is actually an overlay of the home ignition zones, like on an aerial photograph. So we can visualize this with a program that we built for communities, and everybody's home who is tied together through these zones, if you will. They match up with the home ignition zones that we've talked about today. That tells you that if you're grouped together in this group of home ignition zones, then those are the people you need to be working with to reduce your risk.
Got it. That makes sense. And to reiterate, this is great info. That is extension professionals and EMG volunteers. This presentation was really meant to make us more aware of all of these resources that we have as we guide North Carolinians in sustainable gardening. We are not necessarily licensed professionals who are experts like Hannah, so we would call in the professionals when we need to talk about fire safety. The purpose of this is for awareness so that we know where the resources are and where to point folks in the right direction to make these decisions. I see one last question about fruit trees, flammability of fruit trees. Do you have any last insights about those?
Well, I believe if it's like apples, peaches, you know, all the things that don't have waxy leaves, they're going to be a broad leaf, so flat, moisture-filled leaf. If it's something like citrus, I mean, we're not going to grow that outside. It may be indoors or somewhere else. At least I don't think so. Or something like a mock orange. I know we see those in the landscape sometimes. It's all just going to be dependent upon the makeup of the leaves and the vegetation. So just like the characteristics we pointed out today, use your judgment based on what we went over today, based on the type of fruit tree that you're concerned about, and then also the branching pattern of that, whether there's leaves touching the ground, all the things. But I do know that fruit trees go through quite a bit of pruning. So I would just say use your best judgment based on the plant characteristics that we've talked about today.
Got it. And I guess our last question is, Allison Arnold was asking about Alyssium, evergreen azalea. There are some plants that if you look on the plant toolbox, the listing doesn't necessarily yet include the flammability risk. And then maybe it's not included in that landscaping in North Carolina guide that you shared with us. And so would the next resource then be you for a specific species in terms of flammability risk?
It could be. I mean, you can always reach out to us. I'm happy to research any species that you come across. If there is a like cultivar on the list, it may be very similar to that thing which is listed. So that's what I would say. I do know that there's some research on plant flammability, and there's also like a key that can lead you towards identifying the flammability of a plant if it's not listed. I will try to find that and maybe include that in the notes as well. as because of someone's work on trying to identify for a specific cultivar. Yeah.
Yeah, we love that. Thank you, Hannah. We are going to send those resources out by the end of the week as well as the recording. So we're really grateful for you. This was so helpful, and we'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.